We're going to go ahead and use the division of the chapter once again this week so that it's a little easier to listen to the chapter in its entirety in two different parts perhaps. And really the chapter kind of falls into two different parts itself in that the first section really looks upon culture and its impact on human behavior, and the second part talks about aspects of the physical environment as it affects us. So the division is split up in that particular way. The first section of the chapter does address the issue of culture as it affects human behavior. And culture is a topic that I've been teaching for a long time, even back in probably the early 1990s when I began teaching the introductory sociology course at Kenai Peninsula College. Of course, culture is a very big part of that discussion. And it's interesting to me that aspects of the information regarding culture, what we're teaching about culture, and how we really define culture and understand it is evolving over this period of time. And the chapter talks about this some, as if you've read it already, you know that. So this is sort of an updated view on culture. Interestingly, the first slide that the publisher gives us talks about the breakdown of the population in the United States in terms of really what amounts to a racial breakdown of the population more so than the cultural background, although the two of them seem to go hand in hand, at least in the thinking of this particular author. As you know, there's immigration is a big issue in modern day politics, and in fact, it's been an issue in the politics of this country from the very beginning almost. And certainly in the earlier 1800s, the influx of the Irish was of a concern. Around the turn of the century, Southern Europeans began to move here en masse. The Germans had arrived during the 1800s as well, and now the Southern Europeans, including my father's family, the Hungarians, and there was concern around the turn of the last century about the influx of Asians into America, and Chinese in particular were excluded for I think something like 40 or 50 years around the turn of the last century altogether from immigration. The nation has dealt with concerns about Latin America and the migration of individuals from south of the border into America and how it impacts the employment picture and the culture of the United States. And now, of course, more recently, there's been concern about the Muslim American influx in immigration, largely thanks to our president. And so it's, this is an issue that's been of concern throughout. Now, not to, by any stretch of the imagination, minimize the importance of the original population here, the Native American or First Nations people, which in a discussion about immigration and how, the statements are made that this nation was built on the backs of immigrants and all of those kinds of platitudes. It's all very true, but the Native Americans were here to begin with, and really kind of provided the basis for much of what happens later on in our history. So that's another population that is often overlooked when we begin to talk about culture and the various influences, because we think about globally and about people coming here to begin with. And so there's a lot of debate about what's happening to America. I think it's, around 2050 or whatever, where it's been said that the white Americans, Caucasian Americans, will no longer be the majority population in the United States. And this creates a lot of anxiety among large groups of apparently mostly right-wing thinkers, who well, I mean, some of the extremes really want this to be a nation led by Caucasians and for Caucasians, and clearly that's something that is simply not America, and so that is an extreme form of thought. In fact, if you notice here, the Hispanics and Latinos, the population of Hispanics and Latinos has outgrown the number of African American individuals in our nation as well. So it's now the largest minority population. Asians are also a large group of individuals that populate the United States, and again, the American Indians, Alaska Natives, Native Hawaiians, all of those are Native Americans and make up a relatively small group of individuals, according to the Census Bureau at least. And it says here about 40 million people in the United States are foreign born. That number is expected to grow. And it's interesting, I saw on another website from the Census Bureau that said by around 2020, more than half of the nation's children are expected to be part of a minority race or ethnic group. So this puts Americans under the age of 18 at the front of a trend that will see the overall population follow suit some 20 years later. At that time, when minority and ethnic groups will out in combination will outnumber the Northern European ethnic group, the Caucasian Americans, so to speak. So it's just interesting. Also, by the year 2030, 1 in 5 Americans is projected to be 65 or over. The minority population is projected to rise to 56% of the total in 2060, compared with about 38% now. So when you combine, and interestingly, the next slide refers to the definition of what is white. It's a person having origins in any of the original peoples of Europe, the Middle East, or North Africa, including Irish, German, Italian, Lebanese, Arab, Moroccan, and Caucasian. And you see the ancestries of the American white population listed there also by percentage. Now the last comment here says white Americans, that includes white Hispanics, constitute the majority with a total of about 247 million, or 77 some percent of the population as of 2014. Non-Hispanic whites totaled about 197 million, or 62% of the United States population. Now, the interesting thing here, you see, there's the 199 million non-Hispanic whites and the 46 million Hispanics, which added to the white population in this slide is referred to white Americans. And this really kind of tells you something about a trend, something that happens and has happened in our history, and that is as immigrant populations come in, they're first defined as separate groups. And long ago the definition, your census categories or whatever has begun to include white, non-Hispanic, and Hispanic, right? And so gradually what is occurring, and what this slide implies, is that the Hispanic population is gradually being considered a part of the white American population, which is very interesting to me. In the early 1900s, when, for instance, my father's family came over, the Hungarians and other persons, I think probably the Italians and others from the southern part of Europe, were considered, well, Southern Europeans, that was their category. In fact, they weren't considered white for census purposes. And in fact, neither were Jewish people either. They were considered Jewish in the census data. And so, as interestingly, around the time of World War II, when they needed more people fighting for the country, is when all of a sudden all these minority populations began to be considered white in the census. And I think there's a purpose to defining individuals in that respect, and in the end, I think it looks to me like the white majority is just determined to define itself as being the majority and keeping control of this nation. But it's, I think, a lot of to do about nothing. Well, anyway, it goes into a discussion about diversity, which we'll be talking about in a few moments. But the definitions and discussions of culture tend to reflect theoretical perspectives and purposes of the definers, and that's sort of what I was just saying here. When it's to the those in control, it suits them to classify, bring people into the population as a part of the majority, then they do that. Because we construct meanings associated with the social material world through culture, and what is normal is embedded in culture. What we define as normal is something that differs from culture to culture. There are different definitions of culture, which again, it's just for the sake of discussion, I suppose. The knowledge, beliefs, morals, values, customs, language, those kinds of things, which is more or less the traditional definition of culture that a particular group has. That's their culture. but it also includes things like, the learned repertory of thoughts and actions that have been handed down that aren't genetically linked. For instance, I think probably with Latino culture, for instance, the association with the Roman Catholicism is perhaps an example of social heritage and tradition there. We talked about that a week or two earlier, I believe. Ideas, habits, conditioned emotional responses shared by members of a society. Some ethnic groups are I think more expressive in terms of their emotions than others. That's an example of some of the cultural differences there. And also, the symbols and patterns of response and organization of how individuals understand things, what meaning is placed on things. These are all things associated with one's culture, and again, differ from cultural group to cultural group. As I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture, the ideas about culture have changed over time and reflect changes in social, economic, political spheres in our lives. The Enlightenment thinking from the 18th and 19th centuries really is something that still holds sway, and we'll be looking at a slide here in a moment where it tends to rank cultures, some being more preferable and better than others, and this is the kind of thinking that probably is outdated, but nonetheless is used in a lot of debates and discussions about things, some of the social ills of our society, as mentioned here. Biological determinism is something that's mentioned also in the chapter, and this is an attempt to differentiate social behavior on the basis of biological and genetic endowment. Generally speaking, this is something that is defined by the majority culture, and it almost always involves members of a minority culture. So, for instance, there have been attempts over the years to associate race with intellectual performance. There are some really infamous studies of this back in the 50s and 60s, I believe, and there's never been anything to suggest that there's any difference in the intellectual capabilities of any of the ethnic or racial groups around the world. But nonetheless, this idea has been out there and was out there, and even still continues to have some power in individuals' understandings of what culture and all of that means. This breaks ideas about culture and human behavior into three different time periods. The 18th and 19th century, which Enlightenment and Romanticism, where logic and reason, art and technology became important. And it was this was one of the things that ranked the cultures based upon those kinds of features and factors. By the turn of the last century, Romanticism had really kind of taken hold, and there began to be a sense of seeing cultures as being equal, different cultures being equal to each other and not one being better than the other. And this is where this notion of cultural relativism came in. That is, that in order to understand a behavior, an action, or an attitude or belief of one culture, you have to really understand what is going on in the context of that culture itself. And so you can't judge American ways of doing things, for instance, against Syrian ways of doing things. That's cultural relativism, and that neither culture is preferable to the other. Now, in contemporary understandings of culture, certainly there has been some debate about whether cultural relativism is correct, and there are certain actions, for instance, the way women are treated, some of the more barbaric ways that women are treated to control their sexuality, for instance, in some Mideastern countries, is considered to be unacceptable by any standard, and that cultural relativism shouldn't excuse those types of behaviors. Female genital mutilation being an example of that. But a lot of people think that cultural relativism is really, I think the textbook refers to it as being perhaps politically correct or something, and or that people think that it is. And so this is again an example of kind of how our concept of culture evolves over time. The text also looks at culture, this could be looked at at a timeline, as a timeline rather. And in fact, I believe I, it, well, we just got done talking about it in terms of a timeline, but this isn't so much a timeline, but it is how cultures have evolved, according to some thinkers at least. That the pre-modern traditional culture really is. The pre-industrial culture, based mostly on subsistence agriculture, and perhaps it certainly could be said that in many parts of the globe and third world countries, this would be the type of culture that you would likely see there. Modern culture, though, in the largest sense, arose from the 18th century era of enlightenment, and ideas about rationality, industrialization, urbanization, capitalism all became very important in modern culture. And we now live in what is referred to postmodern culture, which involves the global electronic community, and how it is that elements from different cultures all around the world now can be spliced together, and from different times and different places. And so culture again can be defined in different ways, and can be seen as evolving. But traits of all three types of culture exist in advanced capitalist societies today, and this is where a lot of the culture wars, we even hear about that sometimes in current contemporary political discussions about the culture wars, and this is the source of a lot of the culture wars within our society and others today, at least some of the source of it. Now here's the matrix, and this is in the text. Of course, this is Exhibit 6.3 in your text. Characteristics of traditional, modern, and postmodern culture, and you can compare some of the differences there. For instance, in the role of rationality, the traditional culture really kind of leaned more on religious traditions, being superior to reason, and irrational aspects of life were viewed more positively, whereas modern culture really placed a lot of emphasis upon rationality, and postmodern culture questions the limits of rationality. So this is just an example of the different sources of authority. Religious authority being traditional, nation state and science being the modern source of authority, but in postmodern society, national authority breaks down, and this is really a global society. So you see again the concept and the structure of our understanding of culture changes through time. Note also here in the unit of value how what is most valued changes across from culture to culture here as the culture develops. Let's say it isn't even so much across time as it is the development of culture into a more technological society, that we move from communal values in the traditional societies to focus upon individualism and individual achievement in modern culture. And then in postmodern culture, there's more of an emphasis upon diversity and the multiplicity of perspectives and voices. Now, I would have to say this is probably really a look at Western values, at least, the sense of individualism, which isn't necessarily heavily valued in a lot of the cultures of the East, for instance, which is much more of a collective kind of a consciousness than we have. But nonetheless, another example of how culture and its understanding, our understanding of culture, evolves. It's an interesting matrix if you take some time to look at it. Now, there's some concepts in culture that are worth being familiar with. Ideology, of course, which are the dominant ideas about the way things are and how they should work. Ideology, this is our sense of what is normal and what is right about the world. And again, consider that this varies from culture to culture. Now, who defines what is normal and how things should be? We'll touch on that in a moment. Ethnocentrism, which is the tendency to elevate our own ethnic group and its culture over others. We kind of hold our culture as the standard by which all other cultures should be measured. And I think right now we're in a quite a period of ethnocentric. Well, they call it American exceptionalism, I guess these days. This idea that we are the the greatest culture on the earth and everything like this. But understand that ethnocentricity is not confined to America, and in many respects, all cultures have some ethnocentric tendencies. Cultural symbols is something, verbal or nonverbal, that comes to stand for something else. I think the greatest example of a cultural symbol in the United States is our flag, which it's interesting. Having hosted kids from Europe and one boy from China, I get a little bit of a taste of how other parts of the earth views some of the things that Americans take for granted. And one of them was one of my, I think it, well, in fact, I'm pretty sure it was one of my German kids. Couldn't he was impressed with the fact that there were cars driving down the street in Soldana and Kenai with American flags flying on their antenna. The older flag cars still had radio antennas and things like this, and there were flags flying in front of businesses and things like this, and he was just impressed with the fact, and not necessarily positively impressed, but with this. The flag, how we venerate our flag, and I think that well, for instance, the debate in 2017 that the President Trump started about the taking a knee during the Star Spangled Banner, the national anthem at football games and NFL games, and how this was a protest about inequalities involving racial minorities in their treatment by law enforcement, and yet the president turned this into a disrespect for the flag, and this then began to evolve into a thing where we didn't it was disrespect to our fighting forces, and who are fighting for the flag and those kinds of things. No, are they fighting for the flag, or are they fighting for freedom, our freedoms? And it's so the flag has this deep symbolism in America that, well, I don't think exists in most other parts of the globe. And in fact, interestingly, this, I think it was the same boy. It may not have been another. It may be another one of my German students mentioned to me the World Cup soccer tournament was in Germany the year that he lived with me, and he said that there was a lot of concern in Germany because of the flag waving that was going on during the soccer games, because that goes back to the days of Hitler and what nationalism did to that country, and how careful they are to try to keep that sense of nationalism confined in Germany, so that there's no chance of anything like what happened in pre-World War II in that culture to ever happen again. So you see there how symbols mean very different things from one culture to another. Worldview is associated with the cognitive domain. This is what we think about things, is our worldview. But our ethos really is associated more with the emotional or affective dimensions of behavior. So it's more about how we feel about things, and that's our ethos. Culture isn't static; it innovates, and so over time it does change. And culture also involves cultural conflict, that sometimes the symbols that we use can mean one thing to you and something different to others. And so, in general, culture is both private, it's in our head, and it's also public, it's outside of us at the same time. I'm not so sure the culture of poverty really has to do with postmodernism, and more than it is probably more of a kind of ties back into enlightenment and ranking of cultures. But in any event, the culture of poverty, I think, first came up in discussions or in writings back in the 50s, if I remember correctly. Well, I don't remember that, but if I remember what I learned about it correctly. But back in the 50s and in the 60s, and by the time I got to college. Yes, in the 70s, this was really being, debated hotly and really not appreciated in most intellectual circles. But it was originally written about to bring attention to the way of life developed by poor people as they went about trying to adapt to the circumstances of their lives, the oppression and poverty, and the lack of access, equal access to resources of our society, those kinds of things. So the culture of poverty really was intended to describe how poor people learn to adapt to those restrictions in their lives. Okay, but it also was turned around and used to more or less demonize people in poverty, because the victims of the victims of the system became blamed for their own plight, and so the culture of poverty evolved into this discussion about how the values of poor people don't support participation in the economic system, and it does support crime and those kinds of things, and it doesn't support employment. It supports hanging out on street corners, and instead of looking for gainful employment. The culture of poverty took on a whole different kind of meaning during the 60s, and this is the thing that of course was very disputed, but in any event, that culture of poverty argument was used to argue against publicly financed social programs, when originally it was sort of described as written to describe the way people learn to exist with those programs being as limited as they are and maybe as unhelpful as they are. So it was used to not only to explain people on welfare, but also to stigmatize them, and poor single parents and all those other problems of the inner cities, as though poverty was because of what they did and how they raised their children, and didn't and just totally ignored all the structures of society, I suppose, that created this poverty and institutionalized the lack of access. Practice orientation. The text mentions that this is not practice in the terms that we talk about it for social work, but rather the practice orientation seeks to explain what people do as thinking, intentionally acting persons who face the impact of history and the constraints of structures that are embedded in our society and culture. Practice orientation, I suppose, the negative interpretation of culture poverty would use the practice orientation, saying that, well, it's they're acting or not acting to improve their situation, but really, the practice orientation is intended to get us thinking about how it is that why people do what they do. In dealing with where they are at, where their culture, where their group is at in terms of historically and present day, in terms of our society and its restrictions. There's a great book that I'm using in if you're ever looking for another book, a good book to read on social welfare. It's called "So You Think I Drive a Cadillac" by Karen Seacombe, Seccombe, and this is one of the books I use in my social welfare class, and it talks about the the daily lives of public welfare recipients, and what motivates them, and how they get by, basically, and it looks at why some of those individuals, for instance, chooses to stay on public assistance, and it isn't because they're lazy, but why they might choose to stay on public assistance as opposed to trying to get a job, and why does this individual buy a flat screen TV? It's not necessarily a bad choice at all. Those kinds of things. It really kind of looks at how particularly single mothers in this particular text, how they cope within the confines of the public welfare system and the economic system, more to the point, of the United States. And this kind of is what we talk about practice orientation. That's what it's talking about. That the systems are the ones that shape, guide, and direct people's values and beliefs. But also we look at how individuals as human actors can perpetuate or shape social systems themselves. That's the practice orientation. History in culture is made by people, but it's made within the constraints of the systems in which the individuals are living. All these different political, social, economic systems, and includes cognitive, emotional, and behavioral frameworks that are mapped onto who we are as people. Over time, we reproduce the structures when we begin to believe that our values, beliefs, and meaning are correct, and we don't see any reason to change them. And so, this is one way that our groups, our cultural groups, begin to develop a history of its own. Hegemony, and I believe that's the correct pronunciation of this term, is when one set of values, beliefs, and meanings comes to be dominant in a culture. It's cultural hegemony. It's the dominance of a particular way of seeing the world. Now, in America, it's pretty clear that the Euro-American, even really Northern European culture has hegemony. But in the world, the U.S. culture is certainly, and I'm not sure hegemonious is the word, but if it isn't, I just coined it. It is also, the U.S. culture has hegemony across the world. Now, this is of some interest. When we talked about the conflict perspective, I believe, in one of the earliest chapters in this course, conflict theory really kind of grows out of Karl Marx's writings in many respects. I mean, he wasn't the first person to think it up, but he's the one who, became most famous, I think, as an early conflict theorist. Marxists really, I think he wrote about the importance of the economy, but more than being a political leader, I mean, I think he was a sociologist. And think about this in terms of a sociological theory, Marxism. This philosophy said that cultural hegemony is the domination of a culturally diverse society by the ruling class who manipulate the culture of that society, that is, its beliefs, its explanations, its values, its mores, so that the ruling class worldview becomes the accepted cultural norm. In other words, those in control manipulate the culture such that it becomes evident that their worldview is the cultural norm and should be the cultural norm. So this then justifies the social, political, and economic status quo that they implement, that they believe in as being the one that is natural and inevitable, perpetual and beneficial for everybody, rather than as an artificial social construct that benefits only them. This is my own, I confess this has something to do with my own political leanings here. But what comes to my mind when I think about cultural hegemony in the United States is, look at the recent, the 2018 tax cut package, which once again favors the wealthy class. You look at what the leaders of Congress say about that tax package, and they emphasized how in the aftermath of the tax cuts, employers began to give bonuses to employees, and this is the trickle down theory that the more money the wealthy has, eventually it's going to trickle down to the lower groups, and we'll all benefit in the long run. We've tried this 2 or 3 different times at least in our history in the 20th century. Certainly during the pre-Depression days, during the Hoover administration, again the Reagan era as well. It doesn't work, of course, and we know that. But if you stretch it out, I think that. And this is what I think happens with the ruling class, and this is the wealthy class, mind you. If you have a sense that our elected representatives respond more to the people who give them money, for their campaigns, whether it be the Koch brothers or it be the NRA or it be, this group or that group, whoever it is that's funding their campaigns. I get the sense, at least, that they respond more to those people than to us as constituents. And so, what the wealthy people want is what they're going to get, because they manage, basically they control a lot of our elected representatives in Congress. And so the ruling class here, the ruling class is referred to in this particular section is really the wealthy. We're not talking about the president or even the congressman, but the ruling class manipulate the culture so that and kind of advance this view that if they benefit, we all benefit, even though historically we see that doesn't work. And the interesting thing is if you look at it across the 20th century, really, yeah, 30, 40 years between each implementation of the trickle down economics, with tax cuts and things like that. It's enough that many of the voters don't remember the last time that happened and what came of it, and so they can pull this off and convince people that this is somehow it's a new idea and it's going to work when it didn't work in the past. So anyway, you know the interesting thing is they've got the middle class and the working class jumping up and down because Walmart's gave everybody $1,000 bonus or whatever, and raised everybody to, I think, minimum wage to $11 an hour, which isn't by any means a living wage at all. Bonuses really are one-time things, and what really matter is a large wage increase, and that's not something that we heard about after the tax cut. So, but a lot of the working class and middle class have been convinced by the ruling class here that this is all good for them. So this is an example, I think, of hegemony, cultural hegemony in America. Forgive me if that seems too political, but it's really kind of hard sometimes not to pull politics or to take politics out of discussions of social work and social welfare. It's just, they go hand in hand in this country. Now, another concept is human agency, and as this slide suggests, this can be a source of hope for those of us who are working with people or organizations or systems, because it breaks away from the constraints imposed by culture or society. But this is the notion that people don't have to just be puppets, that they can be active participants, and that they're capable of exercising their will to shape their lives. And this is something human agency then can counteract cultural hegemony if it's employed consistently. And I think you can see human agency at work when protests occur and marches occur and those kinds of things. That's human agency at work, and it is sort of the grassroots kind of rising up and trying to create change. But on individual level, when you think about human agency, again, this is one of these things that can be used to hurt people on welfare. I mean, hurt our attitudes about people on welfare, because there is this notion that if you only work hard enough, if you only want to, you can succeed in America, you can become wealthy. We know that's not true. I mean, it's true for a few people, but by and large, most people aren't ever going to be wealthy, and many people have to work 2 and 3 jobs just to make ends meet for their family. But we still blame the poor person for being poor, as though somehow, well, other people can do it, you can too, if you only try harder and you only get a good education, and if you just didn't drink or smoke pot or whatever it is that you're doing. And the truth is that no human being is fully a free agent, a fully free agent, I suppose, is the way I want to say that we all are constrained by external factors such as the resources that are available to us, disease, population size, the climate, and I would say the economic and social structure is probably one of the biggest constraining factors in America for many people that we're going to meet in our work. Culture does provide stability to social life, but it changes over time, but it changes slowly. Culture just by definition, isn't going to change rapidly, but it will change because of other influences that come into it. We'll be talking about that in a moment, but one of the parts of culture that is used sometimes to criticize others, I suppose is what I'm looking for, is common sense. That this is the notion that everyone in a community or society should know this and understand this as a matter of ordinary everyday living. It's just something anybody knows, common sense things. So, but the fact is that not everybody shares these common ways of seeing things, and this is another way to, that minority groups can be oppressed and subjugated because they're not really, they're not getting with it in the culture. They're seen as being less than intelligent, perhaps. Our cultural practices are called customs, and they come into being and persist as solutions to problems of everyday living. How do we deal with things? Customs are developed to deal with the kinds of problems we're faced with. And tradition really is where customs exist over a long period of time, and it's handed down from one generation to another, and it involves a lot of our beliefs and practices, cultural beliefs and practices. But traditions and customs, as the slide says, leaves out the experiences and voices of certain group members while highlighting including others. Now, again, you can believe that would be the ruling class who is defining traditions and customs much more than oppressed groups. This traditions and customs protect the worldview of groups and what it is that life means. Now, as we talk about this, we're looking at immigration, and we're going to talk a little bit about diversity and how diversity is handled in society. Over half of our immigrants were born in Latin America in general, and almost 38% of our immigrants were born in Central America. The influx of Latino citizens has created what is referred to in many social science circles as the browning of the United States, and it is the thing that a lot of that Northern European Eurocentric thinking is reacting to, I suppose, in the modern era as far as immigration is concerned. And I'll just say this, I think, I'm just thinking this is kind of what the basic thought is behind this negative reaction to immigration. That is, it was one thing when immigrants looked like us, but when they stopped looking like us, it becomes a bigger problem. And if you look at the groups that have been ostracized or mistrusted over the course of the last 100 or so years, they're all people who look a little different. So anyway, there's a process to moving into a new culture, and understanding these processes helps us to understand and interpret the issues when we encounter them in our practice with immigrants. Cultural change, and this is, now we're talking about groups again, ethnic groups perhaps, will go through a process of cultural change, and when they move to another culture, and this can be understood in terms of 4 processes that describe minority individuals or minority groups' response to the dominant culture. And we're going to look at this from another side in a second, but this is how the text puts it out. So first of all, there's assimilation, and this in assimilation, and I've heard this described in many discussions, with intelligent people. I mean, educated people saying, well, assimilation is preferable for individuals from minority cultures, because they get along better in society if they assimilate. And that really isn't. I don't think that's accepted as fact by any stretch of the imagination anymore, at least. But when you think about the description of America as a melting pot, we're really talking about assimilation. The assimilation, all cultural uniqueness is abandoned by the minority group, and their culture disappears into the dominant culture. So, Anglo conformity is the ideal in America as far as assimilation is concerned, and I'd venture to say that throughout much of Europe, that conformity to the dominant culture in each of those countries, and largely Anglo, Germanic, and Anglo, at least with the right-wing thinking, that's what is preferred for. Well, these days in Europe, it's much of the Muslim immigration issue over there. Accommodation is another way that cultural change is dealt with for groups and individuals, and this is a partial or selective change. And I think the text says this is the most frequent. I suppose that's true, but the non-dominant group learns to follow the rules and standards of the dominant culture, but only in specific circumstances. And so, in school, the kids fit in very well, but when they come home, they're still practicing the culture, the practices of their primary the culture of origin, I should say. Um, yeah, I, my one of my exchange students was a Swedish boy who grew up in Switzerland. And if you know Switzerland, it's kind of there's three parts of Switzerland. There's the German section, the French section, and I guess the Italian section. And the I think the mountain ranges have a lot to do with that, defining which culture more or less has dominance in the different parts of Switzerland. But he grew up in the German Switzerland, and in he would tell me in day-to-day living, um, they would speak a language. The kids and individuals in Switzerland would speak what's called Swiss German, which is a dialect of German, but it is definitely Swiss, and that's sort of the informal language that the individuals used. But when they were conducting business, say in school or in banks and those kinds of things, they would speak formal German. And it was particularly interesting in his family. I would listen to him sometimes on the phone, talking to his parents, and he would move back and forth between Swedish and German and English, and when he would talk. And I asked him about that, and he said some languages have better words than other languages do, to describe things, and so that's why we switch back and forth. And so anyway, he would speak Swiss German with his friends. He would speak German with his teachers. He would go home and most likely speak Swedish with his parents at home. They still spoke Swedish in the house, but sometimes they would speak English together. And so that's, I think, what you definitely would call accommodation. And it's just kind of an interesting thing. And he's lived his whole life in Switzerland and is still there today. It's just an interesting thing to see that. Now, culturation is where a cultural group remains distinct, but certain elements of the culture change. And this includes things like, the blending of foods and music, dance, clothing, and things like this. And I suspect that yeah, I don't know, but I think this probably talks a little bit about things like if you go into the big cities, the Chinatown or Little Italy and Little Korea, those things, I think is probably an example of acculturations where the group maintains much of its identity, but also has a lot of their traditions and cultures kind of, or traditions and things like that kind of blended into American culture. And finally, bicultural socialization, where the non-dominant group learns to master both the dominant culture and their own, and there's sort of a dual identity. And perhaps that's more what was going on with my exchange student than accommodation. Now, this is a slide actually from my sociology introduction to sociology course when we talked about culture, and here you're looking at in this slide we just left. This is it takes cultural change from the standpoint of the individual blending into society, and it sees it in four different ways. This slide really kind of looks at how societies deal with diversity. What does a dominant group do to integrate individuals from other groups? And you'll see some similarities and some differences, But for instance, there are three different ways that they identify as domination, assimilation, and multiculturalism. And domination really was split into four different ways that the minority, or the majority group, could continue to exercise control and power over the minority group, and of course genocide, population transfer. For instance, the Trail of Tears in our own history, genocide. Certainly, if you look at what happened with the Native American population in terms of numbers in American history, there was genocide in that. We see genocide in some European and African countries today. Internal colonialism, the subjugation and enslavement, and then segregation, which can be split into de jure, which is by law, and de facto, which is in fact, no matter what the law says, in action. Now, all of these types of domination are part of American history. I think if you know history in terms of our dealing with minority groups, both in terms of the Native American population that really was here to begin with, was the original Americans. But it didn't take long for the European Americans to become the dominant group on the continent. And then as other groups came in or were brought into our society. Now, assimilation is, well, it's the American ideal. Send me your tired and your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. I send these the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. This is the inscribed in the Statue of Liberty if you ever visit there, and I think it kind of spells out assimilation in many respects. Of course, it doesn't say send me to them and they'll disappear into our population, but that's the net result of that era. I believe the minority group disappears into the majority culture, and sometimes as if the minority group is, I don't know, vocal enough or big enough or whatever. Some aspects of the dominant culture will change when a minority group is assimilated into it. Foods are a good example of that. I mean, how the American palate has changed over the years. Pizza being a good example of that. Okay. And then finally, multiculturalism, another term that you'll hear used for that is pluralism, where various groups coexist in respect and tolerance and maintain their own unique traditions, and somehow live together peacefully. Now, Switzerland has been the example. Now, there's been some problems with Switzerland with the Muslim immigration. I think there was, some years ago there was legislation that banned the construction of minarets in Switzerland, as I recall, and a very controversial thing in that country. That debate. But Switzerland, I forget how many different languages exist in Switzerland, but it's always been a country that's been very successful in having many different ethnic groups living together and sharing a government and a culture, a society. But we like to think of the United States as a pluralistic society, but it really is much more of one of assimilation. I'm quite sure of that. But I always love, if you've ever heard Father Michael Alexa speak about cross-cultural communication. He talks about well, the assimilation kind of being that blending, where it kind of becomes this soup or whatever. I guess I don't know what analogy he used for that as far as food is concerned. But a pluralistic society, a multicultural society, is like a tossed salad, so that every element of that salad maintains its own unique identity and adds something to the total package. Something different and something lively and something new. That's a multicultural society, and I think we have a long way to go before we could say America is multicultural. Now, this again from that same text, I just wanted to share this with you all. So I think it's an interesting kind of thing, where there's sort of a timeline of humanity to inhumanity, or not a timeline, but rather a continuum of inhumanity, humanity, and rejection to acceptance of all of these ways of dealing with diversity, society's way of dealing with diversity I just talked about. And where do you see America, in this? It's I just think it's a good thing, good slide. Thought I'd share it with you. So finally, when we talk about cultural change, understand that it's not always voluntary, and it's not always free. It's not always open. It's sometimes it's forced on populations. As of course we know that when we think about our own history. The practices that form the basis of institutional norms and values can be harmful and oppressive for some people. And as social workers, we have an obligation to identify when that's occurring and to advocate for change when this is the case, and to help our clients find ways to advocate for change for themselves. We don't In our work we don't want to merely accept the dominant group notions about the meanings of behaviors of the subjugated or exploited groups. And this is something that I think would be very easy to do. We're raised in most of us are probably raised in a dominant culture. Many of us are, at least, and are in our own dominant culture. And our worldview is how we see things, how we interpret things, no matter what our culture. And so when we work with others, we need to be aware of what our worldview is, and open our minds to other worldviews as well, and not just to assume that what we see is normal and is correct and is proper and is understandable as being correct, proper, and understandable for everyone. We have to look beyond our mainstream culture, our own culture, as well as the mainstream culture and tradition, to determine the actions that we take with non-majority people. Otherwise, what we do is we just reproduce the inequality and reproduce the subjugation of the minority group, and really then we lose our effectiveness as human service providers when we participate in that. Well, that's what I have to say about culture. So I hope there's some things, a few gems in there that maybe get you thinking about things and might have even offered some bits of new information to you. So that's it for this section. The next section, you can tune in whenever you like. Okay, thanks.